Hi, my name is Alex Green. Um, Excited to bring this presentation to you tonight. I've got my 8-month-old in the room next to me, so I'm going to endeavor to keep my voice down as much as possible. So for the research paper, I had selected Acts chapter 12 with a particular focus on verses 1 to 19. And this pericope begins with the execution of James, the brother of John, and the subsequent arrest of Peter. The narrative centers on Peter's deliverance from his prison cell, his report to the believers of his escape, of his deliverance, and his eventual departure to an unknown place. It doesn't say where he goes, although interestingly it says where Herod goes. And so there's interesting details that are included and others that are omitted, perhaps due to Luke's knowledge of certain things and an uncertainty regarding other details, such as Peter's whereabouts after the pericope ends. One of the strongest themes of the story surrounds its timing at Passover. Peter's miraculous deliverance at the end of the festival of unleavened bread echoed the many notable events in Israel's history that took place on or immediately following Passover. Israel had been released from Egypt, obviously following the first Passover event, the inaugural Passover. Daniel had been spared from the lion's den around that same time. The 3 Hebrew boys had been saved from the fiery furnace of Nebuchadnezzar. And so Peter's deliverance from prison seems to have been a modern Passover event for the early church, their own Passover. The narrative also serves to reinforce Luke's overall emphasis on the importance and the effectiveness of the prayers of the church and the prayers of God's people. While Luke focused on the miraculous deliverance and guidance from an angel, he was careful to preface the whole narrative with the comment that the church was praying. That's how he sets out to tell the story. And so the church's watchfulness and prayer is remarkable, given that Peter's, the length of his stay in that prison is not known. He may have been in prison for more than one night at some point during that festival of unleavened bread. And so it's remarkable that the believers are found at so late an hour still praying. The narrative also provides lighthearted elements as Luke incorporates humor into the story. Peter's disbelief is only equaled by his drowsiness as he requires step-by-step instructions from the angel to gather his things and to walk out. It's also been observed that Rhoda's character provides comic relief as the service curens, the running slave, a character that was common in the Greek theater. The running slave in other narratives would repeatedly run to their masters and bring fanciful accounts in hopes that they would be rewarded for bringing their report. And they would often be in almost hysterics when they arrived. And so Luke seems to borrow from this because Rhoda doesn't open the door and she seems to go very quickly, but not let Peter in despite the fact that she knows he's there. But she deviates from that, and Luke doesn't demean her or anything. But he does use it, it seems, because she brings a true report. And so he sort of deviates from the usual usage of service curans in this way because she provides an accurate report. So she thwarts the stereotype. And altogether, the narrative reinforces that Jesus is continuing to perform the miraculous through his church, and that he alone sits on the throne. And this is reinforced that he is above every ruler and authority, as it's Peter who is free in the end, and it's his captor, it's Herod, who's struck dead by an angel of God in the verses that follow. So for the 2 rhetorical exercises, I first wanted to look at an instance of ekphrasis in Luke 23, verses 44 to 49. So ekphrasis is either written or spoken communication that's very rich in detail. It evokes powerful and clear images in the minds of readers and hearers. Its purpose is to show the reader the story. A device that's of particular importance in a time where Luke cannot utilize a projector screen and is not going to have illustrations on his scrolls. And so it's very important to have these rich descriptions in a time where visual aids were not readily available, except in theater. And so in chapter 23 of his gospel, Luke writes regarding the crucifixion of Jesus. I'm reading from verse 44 in the NRSV. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. So Luke invites the reader to not just hear about the events, but to participate in the environment where Jesus was crucified. It's the middle of the day, and yet there's no light, or at least very little, as the sun fails to give its light. Many interpret this, and many interpretations of this are that there was an eclipse, but the sun does not give its light. And the curtain, the veil, a critical feature of the temple historically, was torn. It's as though, as you look back in it, and this idea of the Greek theater, it almost seems to be taking place on a stage. It's as though it's all taking place on an ancient theater stage for Luke's audience. The curtain of the stage was not pulled back, but it was torn, and the lights were dimmed in dramatic fashion. Even the crowd's response in verse 48 is reminiscent of an audience gathered to watch performance. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. You see, far from a standing ovation, the audience recognized that the centurion had truly spoken in verse 47. Certainly this man was innocent. And to complete this picture, Luke apparently cites his sources in verse 29, but all his acquaintances, including the woman who had followed him to Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. Luke is both completing the image and affirming that the details of his account came from eyewitnesses. And so the takeaway from this is that with just a few words, with just a short description, Luke transports his reader to the most consequential drama in all of history, the crucifixion of Jesus. The body of Jesus hung on the cross. His lungs took no more breath, and his heart did not beat. Jesus died. But Luke here is both author and illustrator for these events, showing his readers that the most dramatic of events had taken place. The sun gave no light. A curtain tore in an empty room. A Roman soldier praised God. And the crowd was remorseful immediately after they had sentenced a man to death. Far from celebration of justice, they realized that justice had not been done, had been undone. Luke's narrative is fittingly descriptive for a world that had executed its king. And so that's the instance of ekphrasis in the book of Luke that I want to draw our attention to. I want to now and finally discuss an instance of encomium in Acts chapter 2, in verses 22 and 24. This encomium is the commendation of a person or thing that brings particular attention to their praiseworthy attributes. Its purpose is to exalt and bring attention to what is good in a person or an object, with a particular focus on the virtues that were most highly regarded in Greek philosophy, such as justice or strength or power. Be a focus on these things. In chapter 2 of Acts, Luke provides an account of Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost. And within this account, verse 22 gives great honor to the attributes of Jesus. He says, "Fellow Israelites, listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man," it's important, "a man attested to you by God with deeds of power, wonders, and signs that God did through him among you, as you yourselves know. Particular attention is given to Jesus' strength, but it's noted that his power was from on high. This instance of encomium seems to fit more closely into a hymn devoted to God. It's speaking of and praising his attributes, but these attributes are attributed to Jesus. But it's recognized that his source of authority and power is from God, from on high. In verse 24, Luke writes, "But God raised him up, having released him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for him to be held by its power." Perhaps the greatest strength that can be attributed to a person is attributed to Jesus. It was impossible for him to be held within the clutches of death. Jesus did not just have great strength. He was strength personified. That's what Luke's communicating here. He doesn't have strength. He is strength. He doesn't possess power. He's the source of all power. And so the takeaway here is that this part of Peter's sermon makes the claim that Jesus had possessed incredible strength and backed it up with the claim that he had defeated death, the undefeated foe. But importantly, as I kind of highlighted as I was reading through, Peter begins by claiming that Jesus was of Nazareth. He's emphasizing his humanity. He's of Nazareth. Yes, he's of heaven, but he's of Nazareth. And he's a man. He's God, but he's a man. So Luke is emphasizing the mortal body that Jesus had, and that the body that God inhabited and allowed his power to dwell within. And although Luke emphasizes his humanity, he says that that body of Jesus could not be held by the power of the grave. Peter repeats, "This man you crucified and killed, for it was impossible for him to be held in its power." Luke's emphasis on Jesus' humanity in this example of encomium only accentuates his deity. Beautiful. Luke's writing in both volumes demonstrates his familiarity with the Greek rhetoric of his day. As we read through rhetorical devices, it's easy to see them at play as Luke puts together a masterful work that would have stood alongside its contemporaries. But he also uses it not just to be good, but uses it to record an accurate and gripping narrative of the life of Jesus. And ekphrasis is everywhere. He's painting the picture. You can see it happening in front of you. He's author and illustrator, and he does well in both of those avenues. And he establishes in the early history of the church, as I noted from my research paper, this Passover event, this miraculous way that God, almost like God had opened the Red Sea, he opened up that prison for Peter to walk out. And he was doing it through his church, who was praying. I'm glad to have shared this class with you. I'm glad to report it's my final class of coursework. And so I hope I've finished strong. I look forward to watching your videos and sharing some thoughts together in the conclusion of this course. God bless you. And thank you, Professor Brickle, for delivering this class.